This is the withered ledger. And tonight, we balance a debt that was never meant to be paid. 1887, New York was not the city you think you know. The lamplight barely reached the ground, and the cobblestones gleamed with a shine that came not from rain, but from the fluids of the day's business. The business of dying. There was one shop, set back from the street, where the glass windows were never clean and the air was never warm. Locals called it the ledger. Not because it sold meat, but because it kept accounts. Accounts written not in ink but in blood. Behind the counter stood a man they called the butcher who taxed the dead. His customers were not the living. They never walked in of their own will. They were brought, stiff and silent, on wooden carts or wrapped in sackcloth. He would take them in, one by one, and with a care that was almost tender, remove what he believed they still owed. A finger. An ear. A strip of skin the width of a ledger line. The city didn't ask questions. The families never saw their dead again, not all of them, anyway. But something shifted that winter. A delivery arrived late one night, a body no one claimed, a face no one recognized. The butcher took his tax as he always did, but this one bled like the living. And the next day, he began receiving payments of his own. Not in coins. Not in notes. In pieces. Asterisk. The vault of meat. The East River had a smell in the winter that no snow could bury. A mix of rotting timber, wet stone, and something metallic, like a coin pressed too long against the tongue. The people of the lower wards said you could taste the river in the air, even in your sleep. On certain nights, when the tide rolled in sluggish and high, the fog would drag that taste all the way inland, coating the streets, seeping into the breath of those who lived too close. That winter of 1887, something else moved with the fog. Not the sound of waves, nor the wind rattling loose shutters. It was quieter, heavier. A weight in the air, as if the cobblestones themselves were holding their breath. It began with the disappearances. Petty thieves mostly, boys who could slip a pocket without breaking stride, men who traded in stolen watches and counterfeit banknotes, women who drifted between alleys with the light fingers of survival. None of them were missed by the police for long. Such people went missing every week in New York. But this was different. This was patterned. They were last seen in the cells near the East River precinct, cells so damp the walls sweated, so narrow a man could touch both sides without stretching. And when the jailers unlocked them the next morning, the bunks were empty. No broken locks. No open doors. No one saw them leave. The only sound in the night had been the slow, steady creak of cart wheels on wet stone. By the third disappearance, the whispers began. Some said there was a hole under the cells, a forgotten drainage shaft from when the building had been a warehouse, leading straight to the river. Others swore the police were selling prisoners to a labor gang across the water. But the older dockhands, men with eyes milked over by years of brine, spoke of something else. They spoke of the butcher. A shop near Pike Slip, 2 streets back from the waterline. Its windows were always dark, its sign so faded the name was unreadable. The door never stood open, even in summer. The butcher there never seemed to sell meat to passers-by. Instead, heavy wagons would stop at the back door in the small hours, and by dawn, the same wagons would roll out toward the hills where the funeral homes kept their cold rooms. And always, they said, the butcher's ledger was full. Not with cuts of beef or lamb, but with names. Those who saw inside, few and reluctant, said the walls were lined not with hooks and cleavers, but with something like vault doors. Steel-faced, bolted, each the size of a man. When the butcher opened them, they gave off a chill that smelled not of ice, but of something older, deeper. It was said the bodies never left whole. On the night the 4th prisoner vanished, I was sent by the withered ledger to find out what truth, if any, was tangled in these dockside fables. My editor had an appetite for stories the city pretended not to hear, the ones people only told in a lowered voice, as if the walls might lean closer to listen. The precinct's night guard was a man named Halvorsen, built like a stevedore but with the slow, suspicious eyes of someone who'd seen more disappearances than arrests. He did not like questions. But over a flask in the watchroom, with the river wind squeezing through the cracks, he told me about the cart. It's the wheels, he said. They ain't iron. They're wood, but they don't creak right. They sound wet. He swore it came every few weeks, just before dawn. 2 men would lift something heavy, always wrapped in oilcloth, from the cell block's side door into the cart. Halvorsen claimed he never saw their faces under the brims of their hats, but he'd seen where they went. Pike Slip. The butcher's back door. I followed the cart that night. The streets near the river were black canals of shadow, the gas lamps struggling to pierce the fog. My boots slipped on frost-slick cobbles as I kept my distance, the cart's wetwood creak pulling me along like a rope. Once, it stopped beneath a bridge where the pilings lean like drunkards. One of the men climbed down, and I heard something, like a sack being dragged. When he climbed back up, the cart seemed heavier. The butcher's shop stood like a blind man's house, every window shuttered, the door a slab of unmarked oak. A single lamp burned in the alley behind it. The cart rolled under that light, and the men unloaded their cargo. It was not a sack. It was a man. His hands hung limp, a fork still clutched in his fingers as if plucked from supper. His head lolled, and in the brief spill of lamplight, I saw his face pale as wax, eyes open but sunk deep, the mouth slack not from death but from something colder. The butcher stepped into view. He was tall, too tall for the narrow frame of the alley, his shoulders bending slightly as if to fit inside the night. His apron was not stained red, but dark in patches that swallowed the lamplight entirely. He nodded once to the men, then unlocked the steel door at the base of the wall. The hinges groaned. A curl of vapor slipped out, and with it, that metallic tang, stronger than the East River's breath. They slid the man inside. The door shut. The bolts fell. The cart left empty. I stood there long after they had gone, listening to the river's slow lap against the pilings, and to something else beneath it, a faint hum, steady and low, like a hive sealed in iron. It was then I understood why the bodies never surfaced. They were not in the river. They were in the vault of meat. Ledger of the Dead. The coroner had worked for the city long enough to know that paper lied more often than people. Ledgers could be massaged, rewritten, made to forget, men could not. And yet, as Dr. Ezra Caro hunched over the burial records in his cramped office by the East River, he began to feel that the ink itself was conspiring against him. On the surface, the entries looked unremarkable. Names of the deceased, dates of death, notes on cause, and the final resting place. But the repetition gnawed at him. A string of paupers from the Bowery, a scattering of petty criminals from the tombs, even 2 dock workers whose deaths had been blamed on river accidents, all marked, processed, within hours of arrival. That word, processed. It was not the city's term. It was not his. He ran his finger along the neat columns of dates, then stopped. For the week of October 3rd, 6 bodies had passed through the morgue. All 6 had been processed. All 6 had received city-funded burials. And yet, Ezra knew for certain that only 3 had been lowered into the dirt. The memory of those empty coffins returned to him. The way they had been lighter than they should have been. The way the gravediggers exchanged glances when no one was looking. At the time, he had told himself it was just a matter of paupers' burials, maybe filled with stones or scrap to keep appearances. But stones did not leave ledger entries. Stones did not sign their names to the dead. That night, after the other staff had gone, Ezra lit a single lamp and unlocked the lower drawers of the cold room. The slab doors creaked open, sighing out the stale breath of the dead. He slid open drawer 12 and found it empty, though the ledger said it should have held a man named Elias Crow. Instead, there was a thin wax-sealed envelope lying in the center of the steel tray. It was unmarked. The seal was thick and black, not the city's red. He hesitated before breaking it, the wax snapping with a sound like a joint being pulled from its socket. Inside were 3 small items: a folded slip of paper, a fragment of fabric stiff with some dried substance, and a copper coin etched with letters that did not belong to any alphabet he knew. The note read simply, "Full payment received. East River Butcher." Ezra's hands went cold. He had heard the name before, spoken only by night shift workers in the tone of a curse. The butcher was no ordinary tradesman. Rumors said he ran a shop that never opened its doors to the public, yet somehow supplied every funeral home within the district. He was the last stop for certain bodies, the kind whose deaths would not be missed. Drawer 14 was supposed to hold the remains of a woman found in an alley off Hester Street. Instead, there was another envelope. Same black seal. Same coin. Ezra took them both back to his desk, spreading the contents out beneath the lamplight. The coins seemed to hum faintly when placed side by side, as though they were pieces of something larger. The fabric scrap smelled faintly of brine and something meat-sweet, the smell of a butcher's counter left too long in the heat. He knew he should report this, go straight to the police, turn over the coins, the notes, everything. But the thought of explaining what he had found was laughable. They would call it superstition, or worse, they would know exactly what it meant and simply tell him to forget it. So he did the only thing left to do. He went to the ledger itself. In the locked cabinet at the back of the morgue was the official master record, bound in cracked leather. By gaslight, he compared the entries to the ones in his daily register. The differences were subtle but undeniable. Dates shifted. Names were misspelled. And in every altered entry, that same strange designation appeared in the margins in faint, almost erased pencil. E.B. He traced the letters with his thumb, feeling the indentations in the paper. Whoever had written them had pressed hard, as though carving the initials into the flesh of the page. Outside, the city's night noises bled through the shutters, the distant whistle of a river steamer, the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones. But beneath it all, Ezra thought he heard something closer, something wet, like the sound of knives being honed against bone. By midnight, his resolve had hardened. He locked the coins, the notes, and the fabric scrap in his desk, tucked the altered ledger pages into his coat, and left the morgue through the back alley. He would find this butcher. He would see where the bodies went. The East River was black under the moon, its surface broken only by the sluggish passage of barges. Following the alleys eastward, Ezra kept his eyes open for anything resembling a meat shop. Most were closed at this hour, shutters drawn tight, their windows cloudy with years of grease. But near the foot of Market Street, he found one whose sign had no name, only the image of a cleaver carved into the wood. The front windows were blacked out from the inside. He might have walked past it had he not noticed the faintest red glow seeping from the cracks in the doorframe. Not firelight. Not gaslight. Something thicker. As he stepped closer, the smell hit him. Not the clean salt blood scent of fresh meat, but something deeper, sweeter, cloying, the smell that had clung to the fabric scrap in his desk. He pressed his ear to the door. From inside came the sound of chains sliding over hooks, and a low, steady voice murmuring numbers. It was counting. The tone was precise, deliberate, like someone tallying inventory. Ezra backed away, hard hammering, but his eyes fell on a shape at the base of the door, a small envelope pushed just far enough out to be seen. The seal was still warm, and written across it in a sharp, unfamiliar hand were two words. Next delivery. He took the envelope without thinking, shoving it into his coat as he vanished into the darkness. He did not open it until he was back in the lamplight of his office. Inside was a single scrap of ledger paper with a name written in perfect cursive. It was his own. The butcher's price. The first time Caleb Monroe, owner of a small funeral home on Delancey Street, came to the butcher's back door, it was raining so heavily that the East River looked as though it might spill into the streets. He had a body in his carriage, a young man whose family demanded a burial before morning. The coffin sat in the back, the wood swelling in the damp air, and Monroe could feel the clock ticking like a hammer against his skull. The usual embalmers were overbooked, the city morgue was swamped with a cholera wave, and the stench of rot would set in long before daylight. He had no choice but to knock. The door opened not with a creak, but with a silence so complete it felt rehearsed. Behind it stood the butcher, broad-aproned, his face indistinguishable from the meat hooks swaying in the shadows. The air inside was heavy with cold, wet iron, the scent of both salt and something older. Caleb stepped in, pulling his hat low over his brow, and placed his hands on the coffin lid as though steadying himself. "You need it quick," the butcher said, voice more statement than question. His eyes darted toward the coffin and then back to Monroe, as if measuring the weight in his mind. Without waiting for a reply, he stepped aside, letting the funeral director pull the box in. "Quick costs more," he added, already moving toward the counter. Monroe expected a coin figure. Instead, the butcher produced a thin, oil-stained ledger from beneath the counter. The pages inside were yellowed, but each was ruled in neat columns, written in ink that had browned to the color of dried blood. The columns bore no names, no dates, only drawings. A hand, a foot, a rib cage, a tooth. Beside each, a figure, written not in dollars, but in strange symbols that Monroe did not recognize. The butcher turned the book toward him and tapped the picture of a leg. "This one. Tonight." Monroe frowned. "You mean, to take it?" The butcher's eyes hardened. "A tax. For the work. Always paid before the rest is done." Monroe tried to protest, but the man's presence pressed on him like a physical weight. There was something in his stare, not menace exactly, but inevitability. Like a ledger that could never be unbalanced. Monroe's throat dried. With fingers that trembled, he undid the coffin's latch and stepped back as the butcher's assistant, a boy with eyes too wide for his thin face, lifted the lid. What happened next was mechanical. The leg was gone in minutes. The sound was clean, precise, more like carpentry than surgery. Monroe found himself staring at the wall, where dozens of unmarked crates were stacked to the ceiling. From one, a faint smell of cloves and vinegar drifted, the scent of preservation, though he suspected the bodies within were not awaiting burial. The work was completed faster than Monroe thought possible. The butcher's hands moved like a clockwork machine, sealing flesh and arranging the body so that no family would suspect. When it was done, the butcher closed the coffin, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded toward the door. "You'll come back," he said flatly. Monroe left with the coffin in the carriage, his stomach turning not from the act itself, but from the way the butcher had made it seem ordinary. Routine. He told himself it would be the only time. It was not. Word traveled quickly among the smaller funeral homes. Those who could not afford delays, those with desperate families breathing down their necks, found their way to the butcher's back door. Each left lighter than they arrived, not in coin, but in the silent currency of the dead. A hand for a rush job. A set of teeth for embalming that erased every blemish. An entire torso for a burial performed in under an hour. Some resisted, refusing to pay the tax. Their corpses went unprocessed, left to bloat and discolor until families turned on the funeral home itself. Others tried to cheat, bringing in bodies already missing parts, hoping to dodge the price. The butcher's answer was always the same: a closed door, a turn back, and silence. Those homes often closed within weeks. It became an unspoken law: if you wanted the butcher's speed, you paid in flesh. One rainy evening, Monroe returned with a body whose widow had been promised a pristine burial before the Sabbath. This time, the butcher's finger landed not on the picture of a leg, but a page near the back of the ledger. The symbol there was unfamiliar, a jagged shape like a broken crown, drawn beside the picture of a skull. "That one's worth more," the butcher said. Monroe hesitated. "You mean the head?" The butcher's lips barely moved. "The eyes stay. The rest goes." Monroe's mouth opened to protest, but something in the air shifted. The butcher leaned closer, and Monroe caught a glimpse of the ledger's back pages. They were not blank. They were filled with sketches of whole bodies, drawn in ways that made the anatomy seem almost inhuman. Each figure was marked with strange circles and lines, as though mapping something beneath the skin. And each was crossed out with a single, deep slash of ink. "How long have you been keeping that book?" Monroe asked before he could stop himself. The butcher's expression did not change, but the boy, the assistant, turned sharply, his face pale. "Always," the butcher said simply. Monroe felt the words as much as he heard them, their weight sinking into him. He could not decide if "always" meant years, or something longer. When the head was removed, Monroe averted his eyes. The butcher hummed softly while working, not a tune, but a low, steady note, like the sound of wind in a chimney. When it was over, he slid the head into a wax-sealed crate identical to the others in the corner. Monroe left that night with the coffin covered in fresh flowers to mask the absence beneath. The widow never knew. She pressed money into his hand with tearful thanks, and Monroe felt the weight of the butcher's tax heavier than any coin. But what unsettled him most was not the act, nor the secrecy. It was the realization that the butcher's ledger was not about business at all. It was about keeping count. Not of money, not of time, but of something else entirely. And somewhere, deep in his mind, Monroe began to wonder, when the ledger was finally full, what would it be counting toward? Coins under the tongue. The first body came in at dawn, still wrapped in the rough canvas the river police used when they fished someone out. The cloth was wet and smelled faintly of brine, though the East River's taste was more iron and rot than salt. Dr. Elijah Moreland, the city coroner, had learned to expect that smell, but not the small sound that came when he pried the jaw open. It was a clink. Not the rattle of loose teeth, not the dry snap of bone. A clink sharp and deliberate, like a coin dropped in an empty till. He reached in with gloved fingers, expecting a swallowed button, maybe a piece of shrapnel from some dockside fight. But what he drew out was nothing he could place in any ledger of the United States Mint. It was a coin, yes, if one could call it that, but its surface was chalk white, and the edges were not worn by hands or time. They were splintered, fibrous, as though the thing had once been alive. Turning it in the lamplight, he saw faint ridges, the kind only found in marrow. He held it closer, the stench hitting him before the truth did. It was bone, carved down to a crude circle, smooth enough to sit comfortably under a tongue. He placed it on the autopsy tray, where it looked indecently out of place among the metal instruments. By noon, 2 more bodies arrived. One from a pauper's alley in the Bowery, the other from a boarding house where the walls were too thin to keep in the smell of death. Both jaws opened under his hand, both tongues lifted stiffly to reveal the same small disc. Not a single one was old. The cuts in the bone were sharp, clean, fresh work. It was not until the 4th body came in, this one a young woman, her hair still damp from whatever gutter she had been dragged from, that Elijah noticed something else. The discs were not all the same. Each bore a faint engraving, shallow lines barely visible in the poor light of the morgue. One had what looked like a crude pair of wings. Another, a jagged line bisecting a circle. The one in the woman's mouth had no symbol at all, just a pinhole drilled straight through the center. He fetched the coroner's magnifying glass, the kind used to examine powder burns. Under its lens, the bone looked wrong. The surface was not random carving. It was deliberate, the patterns forming something closer to a language than ornament. Elijah's hand lingered over the morgue drawer marked with a wax seal, one of the butcher's seals. He had begun to notice them weeks ago, those neat red stamps on otherwise unremarkable bodies, the same as the ones found in funeral home manifests that passed through his desk. He broke this one open and slid the drawer free. Inside lay an older man, his jaw already tied shut in the traditional cloth. Elijah cut it loose. The coin clattered into the steel pan. This one was different again, heavier, thicker. And there, in its center, a faint coppery stain that no amount of cleaning could disguise. That night, the coroner walked the streets of 5 Points, the coins in his pocket like a weight against his thigh. He went past the grog shops and the alley games, past the dim-lighted corners where women's shadows moved against brick walls. The butcher's shop was dark, as it always was after sundown, its display windows empty of anything resembling dinner. But the side door, the one that opened into the freight lane, bore a faint glow around its frame. He stood there longer than was wise, listening. There was no sound of knives or saws, no low murmur of voices. Only a kind of rhythm, not music, but something close to it, the slow, deliberate scrape of metal on bone. By the time he returned to the morgue, the city outside had gone quiet, save for the restless churn of the river. He laid the coins out in a row, tracing their shapes with the tip of his scalpel. Each bore its own mark, its own symbol. In a book he kept for his private notes, a ledger no one else would ever see, he began to copy them down. Hours passed, ink soaking into the thin paper. The marks formed no alphabet he recognized, but the repetition of certain patterns told him it was not random. Every fourth coin bore the same jagged line. Every second, the same hollow circle. Somewhere in the small hours, he made a connection he could not quite explain. Old funerary customs from the old world spoke of placing coins under the tongues of the dead, payment for the ferrymen who carried souls across the waters of the afterlife. But those coins were metal, valuable in the world of the living. These were worthless, unless bone itself held some currency in a market no man spoke of. The next morning brought 3 more bodies, all marked with the same strange seal in the manifest, all bearing coins of bone. Elijah did not need to break open their skulls to know, though he suspected, with growing unease, that the bone from which the coins were carved had once belonged to others like them. Late that afternoon, a boy came to the morgue. Barefoot, his coat too thin for the season, he handed Elijah a folded scrap of butcher's paper. Inside was a coin. But this one was different. It was warm. Fresh. The edges were still damp, the fibers not yet dry. No words came from the boy, only a small nod before he turned and left. Elijah watched him go, his mind fixed not on the message, but on the implication. The butcher was not only still making them, he was delivering them. That night, unable to bear the weight of his own thoughts, the coroner took the fresh coin to his desk. He set it beside the others, staring at the pale curve of it until the lamplight began to waver and dim. For a moment, he thought the wick had gone out, but then he realized it was not the lamp. It was his vision. The coins blurred, their edges trembling. The marks on them seemed to shift, rearranging themselves. He blinked, but the movement did not stop. The symbols began to connect, line to line, circle to jagged stroke, until the coins no longer looked like separate pieces. They formed a whole. A face. Not human. Not entirely. It smiled at him, a smile made of splintered ivory and the cold promise of a debt unpaid. The debt collector. The first time anyone saw it, they assumed it was a dream born of drink. The East River was shrouded in its usual veil of black fog, and the butcher's shop at the far end of Water Street was nothing more than a shadow on the deeper shadow of the wharf. The boy who told the story later swore he had been awake. He had been watching from the alley between the cooper's yard and the lamppost when it came. No footsteps. No sound at all. Just a vertical shape sliding out of the fog, taller than any man, stooped slightly, as if ducking beneath a ceiling only it could see. It wore what might have once been butcher's aprons, but they had been stitched together from strips of something too pale, too soft, to be leather. At first, the boy thought they were stained with blood, but the closer it came to the lamplight, the more the stains resolved into seams, hundreds of them, running in patterns that no sane tailor would follow. The boy swore each piece of fabric had the faint hint of pores, some bearing fine hairs that fluttered when the fog rolled. The figure moved to the butcher's door. It did not knock. The wood simply opened for it. Inside, the smell of the shop, already rich with the copper tang of slaughter, thickened, becoming something heavier, almost suffocating. The boy fled before he could see more, but others would tell similar stories in the months that followed, and each time the same details surfaced: the height, the stitched aprons, the absence of speech. Those who claimed to see it said it always came after midnight, always alone, and always left carrying something wrapped in brown paper twine. The coroner heard the first of these stories from a man named Hollis, a gravedigger who worked at St. Matthew's Yard. Hollis was not prone to superstition, but he had been unsettled enough to come forward. He had been digging at night, some dispute over an unmarked grave that had to be moved, and he had seen the tall thing pass by on the road, the butcher walking a few paces behind it like an obedient apprentice. He didn't look scared, Hollis said, shaking his head. Didn't look like a man making a delivery, either. Looked more like a man paying a bill. By then, the coroner had already pieced together enough to suspect that the butcher's work extended far beyond supplying funeral homes. The ledger entries, the missing parts, the bone coins, Each clue pointed towards something that was less a business and more a transaction with what? The living? The dead? Something between? He began to track the sightings. The debt collector, as the witnesses had taken to calling it, always appeared on nights when the butcher's accounts showed the most activity. Bodies came in marked as process, and within hours the tall figure would appear, moving through the streets without sound. The coroner went so far as to stake out the shop himself. On the third night it came. He had positioned himself in a narrow gap between two buildings across the street. The fog was heavy that night, and the lamplight carved only a small circle on the cobbles. The butcher appeared first, emerging from the shop with something cradled in both arms. It was not wrapped. He could see the pale shape of a human arm dangling, the fingers limp. Then the fog seemed to ripple, and the figure stepped into view. Its height was even more grotesque in person. It passed beneath a hanging sign, and its head brushed the wooden board. The stitched apron hung low, swaying with each step, and the coroner thought he saw a tooth caught in one of the seams, glinting faintly. They met in the center of the street. The butcher bowed, not deeply, but enough to suggest deference. The figure extended one long arm from beneath the apron, the hand emerging as a pale knot of bone and tendon. The butcher laid the body part into that hand. The figure did not close its fingers around it, it simply took the weight, then turned and vanished into the fog as though it had never been there. The coroner stayed until his legs cramped, but the butcher returned to his shop and the streets remained empty. When he finally left, he carried with him a hollow in his chest, an absence of air that felt like dread trying to learn the shape of itself. Others tried to confront the butcher about the figure, but none could get close enough. He would close the shutters at the first question, bar the door, and let the silence answer for him. One drunken dockworker made the mistake of following the figure into the fog one night. He was found 3 days later floating in the East River, his body perfectly intact except for the absence of his tongue, which had been replaced by one of those crude bone coins. The pattern grew impossible to ignore. Whenever a funeral home failed to deliver payment, flesh, teeth, or bone, the debt collector appeared soon after. No one could say where it came from, or how it knew, but its arrival was always followed by the disappearance of the offending mortician, undertaker, or assistant. In some cases, the family of the deceased vanished as well, as if the debt was transferable. Rumors began to spread that the butcher was not the master in this arrangement, but merely the middleman. The real collector was the tall figure, and the butcher's role was to keep the balance, supplying what was owed before the collector came to take it by force. The coroner's obsession deepened. He began searching old city records, tracing the history of the butcher's shop. He found references to it as far back as 1842, though the butcher himself looked no older than 40. In those early ledgers, there were already notes about deliveries to the tall man, though no description was given. One night, the coroner decided to break into the shop. He did not expect to survive if he was caught, but the need to know had eclipsed caution. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of salt and rot. Hooks dangled from the rafters, some empty, some bearing shapes swaddled in stained cloth. He found the ledger open on the counter, a fresh entry written in a hand that was not the butcher's. The letters were jagged, uneven, as though carved rather than written. It read "Balance satisfied, for now." Then he heard it. Not footsteps, but the sound of something heavy dragging across the floorboards in the back room. The air grew colder, and the smell shifted to something metallic and sweet. He backed toward the door, but before he could reach it, a shadow slid across the floor, stretching toward him though there was no light to cast it. He left without looking back. From that night forward, he stopped asking questions in public, but his private notes grew frantic. He began to suspect that the collector was not merely taking what was owed, it was keeping count. Each coin, each limb, each organ went somewhere, and the total was building towards something. Something the butcher was preparing for. The last time anyone saw the coroner, he had gone to confront the butcher directly. The shop was found empty the next morning. On the counter lay a single bone coin, and beneath it, a folded scrap of parchment that smelled faintly of brine. In the same jagged hand as before, it read, "Debt collected." From then on, the sightings of the tall figure became rarer, but never ceased entirely. Some whispered that it had moved on to other deaths in other cities. Others swore they still saw it in the fog by the East River, waiting patiently for the next account to fall into arrears. But in the butcher's shop, the hooks were never empty, and the ledger was never closed. The meat that was not meat. It began with a smell that had no name. Not the usual reek of the East River, nor the honest stench of a slaughterhouse, but something thinner, sweeter, and more deceitful, the scent of rot hidden beneath perfume. The coroner, pale from sleepless nights and his discovery of the coins, followed it through the cold corridors of the morgue until it led him outside, to the back alley where delivery carts came and went under the veil of darkness. That night, the butcher's cart was there. No horses, no driver, only the creak of its wheels moving slowly, as if pulled by some invisible force. He approached, his boots clicking against the wet cobblestones. The tarp covering the cart sagged with a peculiar weight, and as he lifted it, his fingers brushed against what felt like burlap sacks. But the texture beneath was wrong, soft, damp, and faintly warm. His breath caught. These were not sacks. They were torsos stripped of limbs, their skin peeled away in wide, careful sheets, leaving pale flesh that glistened in the moonlight. Yet something about the flesh was altered. The muscle fibers ran too straight, too uniform, as if they had been grown rather than lived in. He stumbled back, the tarp slipping from his grasp. That was when he heard it, a low grinding, like millstones crushing grain, coming from the direction of the butcher's shop. Every instinct told him to walk away. Instead, he followed. Inside, the shop was lit not by lanterns, but by an ember glow that seemed to come from the very walls, seeping through cracks in the wood. The counter was empty. No knives, no hooks, no cleavers. Just a long wooden table covered in stains that were either fully blood nor entirely grease. Behind it, a door was ajar, and beyond it, the grinding grew louder. He pushed the door open and found himself staring at a contraption that no butcher's trade had ever required. It resembled a press, but built from mismatched iron gears and pulleys, its great wheel turned not by hand or steam, but by something breathing, deep, slow breaths that made the beams tremble. The press was clamped down upon a mass of pale flesh, pressing it flat into thin, parchment-like sheets. From the other side, these sheets dropped into a trough, where a cloudy liquid was poured over them from a suspended bladder that pulsed like a living organ. The coroner leaned closer. The sheets twitched. A voice rasped from the shadows. "It is not meat yet." The butcher emerged, his apron dark and wet, his hands gloved in a thin, glistening film. In his palm, he held one of the bone coins, its edges newly carved. He set it upon the flesh, pressing it into the surface until the imprint sank in, and then peeled it away. The flesh seemed to remember the shape, holding the mark as if it had been branded. The coroner's mouth went dry. "What are you making?" The butcher gave a strange half-smile, as though the answer were obvious. "The debt must be paid." He gestured to a rack in the corner. Hanging from it were slabs of flesh, cured and dried, but not like beef or pork. These bore features: a faint curve of lips, the edge of an ear, a shadow of an eyelid. He touched one reverently. "They think they bury their dead whole. They think their families rest beneath the earth. But you cannot bury what is still owed." The grinding stopped. From somewhere below the floor, a deep knock echoed, like a fist striking a coffin lid. The butcher stiffened, turning toward the sound. "It comes early tonight." The coroner stepped back. "What does?" The butcher's eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment, something in them was almost pleading. "If you want to keep your shadow, leave now." But the coroner could not move. He heard the knock again, closer this time, and the boards beneath his feet seemed to swell and groan, as if something were pushing upward. Then the floor split, and the skeletal figure from the witnesses' accounts rose into the light. It was taller than before, its apron stitched from newer skins, the seams still wet. In its bony hand, it held a hook that glimmered faintly, and dangling from it was a strip of flesh that twitched like a fish out of water. The butcher bowed his head. "Payment." The figure stepped forward, its jaw opening slowly, far wider than bone should allow, until its mouth yawned like a trapdoor into blackness. The hook and its offering vanished into that darkness without a sound. When it was done, the figure turned to the coroner. Its eye sockets were empty, but somehow, he felt the weight of its gaze. The butcher stepped between them quickly. "Not this one," he said firmly. "Not yet." The figure hesitated, then sank back into the floor, the board sealing over it as though nothing had happened. The butcher wiped his hands on his apron. "The meat you think you know," he said quietly, "is only what the living eat. The rest belongs to him." The coroner, shaking, turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he saw something in the press's trough. One of the sheets of flesh had cooled, stiffening into a texture almost like paper. Carved into it, in jagged, uneven letters, were words he could not mistake. They were not in English. They were older, their meaning heavy with a kind of authority that made his bones ache. He realized then that the butcher was not selling meat at all. He was producing something else entirely. Something meant to last far longer than food, something that could travel between worlds. And the worst part was, the sheet was still breathing. The last transaction. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in thin, unwavering streams, as though the sky was trying to rinse the filth from New York's streets, but could never get deep enough to reach the Rio rot. Beneath that restless downpour, the butcher's shop looked even more skeletal than usual, its boarded windows dripping like weeping eyes, the front awning sagging with water, and the smell, thicker than the weather should have allowed. Coroner Ellery stood across the street, collar high, hat brim low. In his hand was the last of the wax-sealed envelopes he had found in the morgue drawers. He had not opened it yet. It felt wrong too, like pulling the final stitch from a wound that had been keeping something terrible inside. But he also knew there was no avoiding it. The moment was already here, whether he acknowledged it or not. Inside the envelope was no paper, no letter, no list of names. Only a thin, brittle disc of bone, smaller than the coins under the corpse's tongues, but carved with the same strange markings. They were sharper this time, etched with care rather than hurried. And along the rim was something he could read, Ultima Venditio. The last sale. Ellery slipped the disc into his coat pocket and stepped off the curb. The street felt longer than it had when he had crossed it in daylight before. The air was heavy, and with every step, the sound of the rain seemed to pull away, as if he were walking into a room padded with meat. The door to the butcher's was unlocked. It never was. He pushed it open and the bell above it gave a hollow, strangled sound, less a chime than a cough. The shop was dim. Hooks swayed gently overhead, though the air was still. No meat hung from them. The long counter was bare except for a single knife, the handle wet as if just washed, and behind it stood a block of wood so stained it looked as though it had been drinking for years. "Ellery," came the voice. The butcher was there in the far corner, his bulk shadowed, his apron darker than the shop's walls. His face was unreadable, not because of the light, but because it was not meant to be read. "I was wondering when you'd come," the butcher said. "The ledger's closed. But there's always one last entry." Ellery's hand tightened around the disc in his pocket. "It ends tonight." The butcher shook his head slowly, like a man pitying a child's misunderstanding. "No. It ends for you. The work goes on." From the back room came a sound, a slow dragging, like a chain over wet stone. Then it stepped into view. The debt collector. It was taller than the doorway should have allowed, shoulders scraping the frame as it entered. The apron sewn from human skin hung stiff and shining in the dim light. Where its eyes should have been, there were only deep, polished hollows, like sockets scrubbed too clean. In its hands, long, patient hands, it held a pair of iron tongs, the edges dark with something that was not rust. Ellery's voice was low, unsteady. "You don't need me." The butcher smiled, an expression so small it seemed accidental. "Every market needs a witness. You've been keeping accounts without realizing it. Every coin, every limb, every tooth, you've known what it all meant." The debt collector moved forward. Ellery backed into the counter, the knife at his side. He could feel its weight calling to him. but the butcher's voice pinned him still. "You think the coins were payment?" the butcher said. "They're not for me. They're for the crossing. And when the crossing fails, when the toll is unpaid, the debt must be settled another way." Ellery realized the coins carved from bone had always been taken from the living, not the dead. That was why they were freshly cut. That was why the collector came. The figure loomed over him now. The smell of its apron was worse than any unwashed corpse, sweet, warm, and choking. The butcher placed a hand on Ellery's shoulder, heavy as an anvil. "The last transaction is yours, coroner." The collector opened the tongs, and Ellery saw, in the reflection of the wet metal, his own mouth slightly open, the disc of bone trembling between his teeth. He did not remember putting it there. He tried to speak, but the moment he did, the collector clamped the tongs, not on him, but on the coin, pulling it free with a motion too clean for something so final. The room seemed to tilt. His legs gave way. The butcher caught him, lowering him gently, as one might a side of meat that had just been weighed. The last thing Ellery saw before the darkness closed in was the ledger on the counter, its pages yellowed and damp, with the new entry already written in the butcher's careful hand: Ellery James, paid in full. The rain outside never stopped. But when dawn came, the butcher's shop was boarded tighter than ever, and no one in the neighborhood could quite remember when it had last been open.